front wheel by removing the axle, pinch bolts, and the brake caliper. It's okay to leave the brake caliper hanging by the hose while you perform this job. Just be careful not to press the front brake. Finish tapping out the axle with a rubber mallet and be prepared to catch the axle as it comes out the other side. The next step is to loosen the triple clamps that hold the forks in place. Be careful not to allow the fork tubes to slide out and land on the floor. It's very important when working with forks to have a clean and well organized workspace. Remove the plastic fork leg protectors, and then you'll want to clamp the fork leg in a soft jaw vise, or you can improvise using a regular vise with some wood. Now screw the damping adjuster all the way open to the left until it stops. And now you'll need a large ratchet and socket to remove the damper rod holding nut. Now you'll need to compress the fork with your left hand and push it in while preparing to grab it with your right hand. This requires a special tool, but you can use a crescent wrench or some other open-end wrench to grasp it and pin it as shown there in the video. With the fork damper rod held out, you can then loosen the nut from the lock nut and separate the damper assembly. You can now remove the clip and allow the fork to expand, and it's a good idea at this point to drain the oil from the outer fork leg before proceeding. The fork has outer and inner oil in the cartridge, and so far we've only drained the outer oil. Now we begin to remove the cartridge cap from the top of the fork using a special tool. This is a Motion Pro tool designed for a Honda fork cap. If you don't have the special tool, don't use just any tool, and especially don't use a pipe wrench to remove the fork cap. Drain the rest of the oil and then put the fork back in the soft jaws. You can now remove the dust seal. In between the dust seal and the fork seal is a metal circlip that fits in a groove, and it's easy to remove with a flat blade screwdriver. Now you can use the outer tube as a slide hammer to pop the seal and bushings loose. You can see from the video that left to right we have first a bushing, and then another shiny bushing, a big flat washer, the main fork seal, the circlip, and then the dust seal. Try to keep the parts in order as you take them apart so you can compare them to the kit parts. The next step is to clean everything thoroughly, and you can't possibly over clean a fork leg. Removing the dirt and dirt particles inside the fork is critical to operation. Now you're ready to begin removing the kit parts from the package and lay the parts out in the order that you expect to install them. Each kit is different, but you will find a variety of seals, bushings, and O-rings in the kit. The first step is to replace the wear ring on the outside of the fork tube. You should be able to slide this part on by hand fairly easily. The next step is very important. You want to wrap the end of the fork tube with some masking tape or other tape, electrical tape, to keep the fork seals from hanging on the grooves. Then lubricate the inside of the dust seal and the fork main seals to make sure they can slide over that area smoothly. If you skip these steps, you're probably going to ruin one of those seals trying to push it over the lip of those grooves. Now carefully install the dust seal first with the spring part facing downward toward the bottom of the fork leg. and put the remaining parts on in the same order you took them off. The circlip, now the main fork seal, again being careful on the grooved part, followed by the flat washer, the small shiny bushing that goes up by the washer. Then you'll have to remove the masking tape to put the final bushing on, because it fits right there in that groove. Now carefully reinstall the fork outer tube over the inner tube and put the shiny bushing and the flat washer inside the top of the fork tube. For this next step, we use a special fork seal driver, also made by Motion Pro. This is an important special tool to have if you're going to work on your forks. You can improvise and cut some PVC, but it won't be nearly as heavy. After driving in the bushing and the flat washer, reattach the driver and drive in the fork seal until it stops. You can tell by sound and by feel. Then all that's left is to reinstall the circlip. You can push that in with your hand, with your fingers. Make sure that it's firmly in the groove around the inside of the fork tube. And then pop on the dust seal. And finally, install the dust seal with your hand, and you'll probably have to tap it with a rubber mallet. Just be careful not to use a regular hammer, because you can scratch the inner tube if you do that. And now we begin working on the damper assembly. First step is to replace the O-ring on the outside of the damper near the threaded part, and then we remove the bushing at the bottom of the damper assembly with a flat blade screwdriver, very carefully prying it downward while being careful not to touch the inside of the seating area. You might have to work on this a little bit. Now install the new bushing in place of the old one. You can see there's a gap there at the end. That's perfectly normal. Make sure it's free to rotate and you're good to go. Now here again we're using our special tool to remove the inside of the damper assembly. You can use an open-end wrench or a crescent wrench, but it's much easier if you have the special tool. And you'll need to wiggle this a little bit when you pull it out. The damper can get stuck. Now begin replacing the O-rings one at a time in order, starting from the top of the piston assembly and working down. Each of the O-rings is a little different, so you'll be able to tell which ones are which. And then do the two bushings that are on the outside of the piston assembly. You can see from the video that these can be quite difficult to remove, and you'll just have to use some patience and a flat blade screwdriver, being super careful not to scratch any of the components or the pistons or to damage the O-rings. It makes the job much easier if you lay out all the parts in advance in order and install them from top down. You can see that this assembly takes a little time, but we shot this sequence in one long piece, so there wouldn't be any question about what order things went on. Okay, here we're installing the two bushings that go on the outside of the piston, and we did clean that thoroughly before putting the new bushings on. The main trick here is having a clean area and not scratching or gouging the aluminum. And here we put on the last O-ring on the damper assembly. And last but not least, we have the tiny O-ring that goes on the bleeder stem. If you have a screw or a bleeder stem, either way there's an O-ring underneath there. The next step is to fill the damper assembly with a good quality, preferably synthetic oil, and begin bleeding the damper. You want to pull that or pump on it a few times, make sure the bubbles get worked out. And it's a good idea to push up on the damper rod, the inner damper rod, a little bit. It makes it easier to push the top cap down into the damper assembly before you screw it on. And again, this special tool will help you apply some downforce while you're turning the screw head. And then bleed the inner damper by pushing it in and out several times and allowing it to drain out of the top hole. Returning to the vise, you can then install the fork spring and then reinstall the damper cartridge and one long piece into the outer fork tube. You're going to need the special tool again. The procedure is the same. As you push inward on the fork tube, you pin it, and that will hold it in place while you reinsert the damping adjuster extension, and again turn the damper to the left and tighten the cap screw down, and then you're ready to tighten down the damper assembly, the bolt to the lock nut using the socket and the open-end wrench. Now push down on the top of the fork to unpin the cartridge, allow the damper to retract into the bottom of the fork leg, and you can tighten down the bolt with the socket to the factory recommended torque specification. Now here we're measuring out the oil for the outer tube, which for a Honda is somewhere between 360 and 400 cc's. This will vary by model and preference, but check your owner's manual or your service manual for the actual amount. And finally, we screw the damper back into the outer fork assembly using the special tool, and we're ready to reinstall the forks into the triple clamps. We like to clean everything thoroughly before sliding the fork tubes back up into the triple clamps, and make sure you get everything lined up. Route the cables, line up the bleeder screws, and that's all there is to it. Ride safe.
For more information on the products featured here, please head to our website, DennisKirk.com.